I'm Dan Poblocki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with artists working in the genre today. Well, here we are at the end of January 2025, and I don't know about you, but this has been quite a month. Working on this project has been sort of a balm, a relief. It's good to have something to do, to focus on. I've actually been struggling with the horror genre lately, feeling so much anxiety about what's happening in the world, and it's good, I think, to talk about these things with other people who are making scary things. And I hope it's good for you to listen to it, because I'm going to keep trying to make these episodes and talk to people that I want to talk to about fun things, scary things, things that we're making, and how we make them. Now, I guess getting into today's conversation, ever since I was a kid, I've loved watching movie previews, especially ones for upcoming scary movies. I recall distinctly the first time I saw the preview for the 1987 anthology horror sequel, Creepshow 2, specifically the moment when a slime monster rushes up onto the shore of a lake in a gooey black wave to attack a horrified onlooker. I didn't know at the time that the scene originated in one of Stephen King's short stories called The Raft. But when I found the collection Skeleton Crew on my grandparents' bookshelf during an overnight visit, I quickly read all the gory details that I knew my mom would not let me watch on screen. And boy, did it mess me up. But also, it had a profound effect on my psyche. It probably turned me into the writer I am today. So you can imagine how thrilled I was when author Adrianna Cuevas suggested we talk about the Raft segment of Creepshow 2 on Our First Fears. I hope that our discussions of body horror, the concept of morality in modern horror, the science of human decomposition, especially on body farms, and poorly behaved teenage boys getting what they deserve, is as fun to listen to as it was to participate in. Adrianna Cuevas is the author of the middle grade novels The Total Eclipse of Nestor Lopez, an ALA Pura Belpre Honor title, The Ghosts of Rancho Espanto, which won the Edgar Award, The No-Brainer's Guide to Decomposition, currently longlisted for the Bram Stoker Award, and the soon-to-be-released What Fell from the Sky, along with many more. She lives in Texas with her family, and I'm so glad that she agreed to speak with me. Now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore Our First Fears. Hello, Adrianna. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. So happy to have you here on the podcast talking about Our First Fears. Before we get into this story, this part of this film that you brought to the podcast, which is The Raft from Creepshow 2 and also a short story by Stephen King, can you tell us about yourself, your work, and your relationship to the horror genre?
So sure, I am actually a former Spanish and ESL teacher. I taught for 16 years, but I decided to just see if I could make a go of writing books and stopped teaching and ended up putting The Total Eclipse of Nestor Lopez out. And it was successful, I guess you could say. And
That's awesome.
I've actually put out 9 books in 6 years because my 9th book comes out next month.
How are you doing all of that?
I attribute that to my ADHD, in all honesty. Yes. And in all honesty as well, the success of Nestor has let me publish that many books in 6 years as well. Because that book did so well, I think publishers were willing to publish me as much as I wanted to.
I read the book that you had come out last fall called No-Brainer's Guide to Decomposition, which is such a fun read, a grody read. We can get a little bit into that a little bit later. That also, I just want to mention to listeners, was longlisted for the Bram Stoker Award. It's on the preliminary ballot. So if you're a voter, check that book out. It's really fun. It's really scary. scary and but also really heartwarming. Adrianna, I cried like a lot.
Yes, one of my very good author friends, Andrea Beatriz Arango, says that my brand is that, I hook you with adventure and spooky, but then somehow manage to make you cry. And yes, I feel like I did that with No Brainers. But my favorite part of No Brainers perhaps is the dropping body parts at random times.
Oh, for sure. Yes, I want to ask you about that a little bit later. The second question I ask all of my guests is, can you tell us about the first time you recall feeling frightened?
I feel like it seems almost cliche to answer this because it seems like a common childhood fear, but the lost in the grocery store is a common fear of mine. And I remember that happening to me. And I'm starting to suspect that I feel like my dad was perhaps purposefully trying to lose me in the grocery store, because now that I think about it, it happened a lot. Where I would be separated from him in the grocery store. So I don't know what was going on, but I feel like the truth was I was probably a wanderer. I feel like I rather instead wandered away from him quite a bit in the grocery store. But I do know that my first fear was looking around and realizing you are no longer with your parent. And what happened? Where are they? I'm in the middle of Publix in Miami, Florida. And where is the adult who is supposed to take care of me? Yes, that was probably my first fear.
Oh, yeah, sure, for sure. Like, what a primal thing for a kid to feel separated from a parent. And I'm not sure how old you are, but I'm in my late 40s, late Gen X. I don't know.
I'm 46. I think you and I are both. We get lost between are we like the elder millennials, or are we like the youngest you can possibly be to be Gen X? Yes.
I think that's where we are. I've heard Xennial. I don't know if I maybe reject that term. I'm not sure. But the point is, when people our age were young, there was so much in the media about kidnappings and be careful of, talking to strangers. And I know that's still a valid thing, but like back then it was like you sat down with your parents and had conversations about not getting into a van somewhere or something. So the idea of something very innocuous like getting lost in a grocery store, all of that preamble that came from parents and what we were hearing at schools and all that stuff must have just added the terror of like, oh no, they're gone. My parents are gone. I'm going to be kidnapped. Who knows? I'm never going to get home again. What a scary thing for a little kid to sort of have to grapple with,
Yes. Well, and I think too, you also, I don't know what your grocery stores were like growing up, but mine, the second you walked in, there was a huge wall of missing child posters at mine. So right there, the second you entered the grocery store, it was like, you don't get separated from your parent or you're going to end up on that wall. So yeah.
I think that's the Gen X thing I was talking about. Like it was in the air or something. I don't know.
It was.
That's a good one. But you survived. Your father found you. I'm glad to see that you're still here and you're writing books and making art and relating to kids and helping them get over their own fears. That's what we can do.
Yep.
So when I asked you what you wanted to talk about on the podcast, you mentioned like Tales from the Crypt, or those short kind of anthology stories, and Creepshow, and the one that leapt out that you remembered was The Raft from Creepshow 2, the film. Now, did you see Creepshow 2 and read the book, or did you only see the movie?
I inadvertently watched it on television because I remember exactly. It was on TV on a Sunday afternoon, and my dad was watching it. And so I just wandered into the living room and watched it with him. And I was definitely way too young to be watching it. But that that was my entrance into horror in a nutshell. I even talk about this during school visits. My dad was my entry into horror. He took me to see Aliens 3 in the theater when I
Wow.
was too young to see Aliens 3 in the theater, but I absolutely loved it. So again, this was a guy, he enjoyed horror as well. So he was watching Creepshow 2 in the middle of Sunday afternoon on TV and not really minding that his young daughter ended up sitting on the couch next to him watching it as well. And I think I ended up liking much gorier horror than he ever did, but he definitely was my entrance into the horror genre.
It's funny, a lot of the people I talk to on here, it's usually a parent who is a horror fan who introduces them to something maybe that they shouldn't be watching at a certain age. So it's funny to hear that your dad was one of those fans. I remember being intrigued by the trailer for this movie. And it was especially the segment from the Raft that freaked me out, made me really want to look it up. I don't know if I was old enough to watch it. My mom probably was like, nope. But I was able to track down the short story in the Stephen King collection, Skeleton Crew. I read that and was able to experience a different sort of version of the Raft than the one that the film made. Did you ever read the story?
I didn't, and
Okay.
now I feel like I really, really need to go back and do that.
Yeah.
But I feel like we all got caught reading. I read The Stand by Stephen King. I felt like I jumped from that, from picture books, and read that when I was way too young to be reading that.
Well, it's funny, and not to self-promote here, but one of the reasons I wrote the two novels disguised as story collections, Tales to Keep You Up at Night and More Tales to Keep You Up at Night, that came out in the past couple years, was because I wanted to write something that was as sort of fascinating and scary and gross and horrifying as the stories that I was reading in those Stephen King collections, but that were for 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, So the Raft really was very much an inspiration for wanting to tell those kinds of stories. So I'm glad you brought it here. Just to give a sort of like a rundown of the film itself, very briefly, this segment, The Raft, was part of a film called Creepshow 2 from 1987, directed by Michael Gornick, actually written by George A. Romero, based on the Stephen King story The Raft from 1985 collection Skeleton Crew. And originally, that story was published in 1982 in an issue of quote-unquote a men's magazine. I don't want to say the title of, because I don't want people Googling it and maybe ending up on a site they don't want to be. But the cast of this very short segment is an actor named Paul Satterfield, plays the character Deke. Jeremy Green plays Laverne. Daniel Beer plays Randy. And Paige Hanna plays Rachel. So very small cast, very intense story. For our listeners, do you want to tell the plot synopsis of what it is we're talking about? Do you remember?
I'm afraid I'm going to remember it wrong.
No, go ahead.
I can picture the ending.
Yes.
I hope I'm remembering right, and you're going to correct me if I'm wrong.
All right.
My recollection, it was about a group of teenagers who go to this lake.
Yep.
And there's a raft out in the middle of the lake, correct?
Correct.
And they swim out to it, but there's some kind of substance in the lake that bubbles up and keeps attacking them. The thing that stuck out with me most from the whole thing was the very end, where there's only two. I guess we're going to have to just spoil the whole
We're spoiling
story.
it. We spoil it.
There's only two of them left. There was the boy and the girl. And they realize they have to try to swim for the shore, because two of the boys have already been like consumed by this substance in very, graphic manner. And the boy chooses to like lay the girl down on the raft, and the substance like seeps up through the slats of the raft and starts to consume her, all so that he can jump in the water and make for the shore. And so you think he's made it, all because he was just this awful, awful dude that sacrificed her so that he could get away. And so you think the whole story's over, and he's standing on the shore, and at the very last minute, this like massive wave from the lake just shoots up out of the lake, and then it pauses, like it freezes, but you're supposed to assume that it just engulfs him. And I kind of loved that ending because, one, I felt like justice was served. I was actually rooting for the substance at the end of the story, because that guy was so terrible in sacrificing the woman. And two, I was so fascinated by a horror story where no one survived. I thought that was really neat. I think as a kid, I didn't know that was possible. I thought not that everything had to have a happy ending. I guess maybe because I was a kid, and so far the only stories I had been exposed to all had happy endings. So to be faced with a story like this where everyone died, it was kind of cool.
Yes. I love that was your response. You're right. It fades to black after this wave of the oil slick comes up onto the shore to get this kid who's basically taunting it. He's saying, I beat you. Right. I beat you. And it's like, no, you didn't. It reaches up, fades to black, but then you actually see from almost the car's point of view, the car that the kids have arrived on, parked on the shore. It shows the oil slick seeping back into the lake with his body in its clutches. And then the camera pans over to a sign that is sort of been overgrown by trees and branches. It says no swimming. So that little punchline, that little like these,
ominous, like had you just listened, none of this would have happened.
I think you described the plot very well.
Which I want to point out, you and I both said how old we were. I'm 46. I want to say I was probably 8 or 9, maybe 10 when I saw this. I'm telling you, for me to remember that, I mean, that is how meaningful this story is to me, that I remember it. There's a lot of things I don't remember a lot. I barely remember what I ate yesterday. So for me to remember this, that's how much this story has impacted me.
It's that Stephen King story, I think. And the adaptation, is pretty faithful to the story itself. It's kind of grody in a way that the character Randy does very inappropriate things with the character Laverne without her consent. And so, so cheering for him getting eaten in the end, it feels totally valid. What's your experience with Stephen King as a writer? Are you a fan of his? It's because I think the reason that this story stuck with me is the power of the Stephen King story. He's just so good at coming up with a high concept pitch,
I like his matter of fact way of writing. But what's really funny is my favorite story of his is actually The Shawshank Redemption.
Oh, yeah.
He has a way of writing very emotionally, and I just really enjoyed that story, which it's not necessarily like a horror story, I guess you could say. But no, he writes the human condition so well. And he exposes the human condition so well. And that's what I like about his writing. Because even in this story, he exposes the human condition so well, how willing we are to turn on each other. And so I think that's what I like about his storytelling. I think he has the human condition down.
Because the 3 stories that are in this Creepshow 2 film are so succinct and very much a punch, right? Do you think that this story is just kind of like horror candy, or is there more to be explored in what is happening to these kids. I mean, just to sort of give the background of why the kids have gone out to this raft in the first place, I believe very briefly they say they're trying to hold on to the summer season, one last sort of, let's go out to the raft. I know it's going to still be there. We can have our fun, and then the summer will be gone. They're holding on to this last sort of yearning for youthful fun. And I guess I say that after I've asked this question, is this just horror candy? Maybe as a leading question, but what do you think about that? Is there more to be explored in these kind of very short, punchy, comic book style short stories?
No, I think that's the beauty of them, though, because they can be both. If you want it just to be casual viewing, it can be. You could just, I'm sure my father sat down and watched that because he wanted a leisurely Sunday afternoon fun horror watch, and he got it. But years later, you and I are sitting down and talking and dissecting this one episode, and we can do that because there is actually deeper meaning to be had. I think it's the beauty of those movies and the short stories is that it's what you want to make of it. And I love that, honestly, about the horror genre. There are so many horror stories, horror movies, that it really is what you want to get out of it. If you want to just sit there and be scared, if you want to just sit there and enjoy it, you can. But there's a lot of horror out there that is filled with subtext and deeper meaning that if you really want to dive into it, you can. And I love that it really is whatever you want to get out of it. Yeah. And that's the beauty of horror.
Like, what did it mean to you as a kid experiencing this? Did it resonate in some way? I mean, clearly it stuck with you, but when you're watching it as a kid, what do you think you took away from it?
I think I was scarred a little bit because it was it was very scary. And I think here's the thing, we said that there were 3 episodes in Creepshow. This is the only one I remember because I'm fairly certain it's the only one I watched because I'm pretty sure my dad was like, I don't think you should be watching this, and changed the channel, turned it off. I don't know. But I think similar to when, he and I watched Aliens 3 together, the reason that I bring up Aliens 3 when I do school visits is because I always tell kids when I do school visits, I talk to them about what it's like to be an author with ADHD. And I talk to them about how the horror genre is actually really, really good for readers with ADHD and writers because there's a lot of tension. It tends to move really quickly. You're wondering what's going to happen next. So it keeps your attention. So I think for me, sitting there, this little kid with undiagnosed ADHD, it held my attention. And so I think it kind of opened this whole world of this genre where, oh my gosh, my mind wasn't wandering as I watched this. This held my attention. I was concentrating. Give me more stories like this. So I think it was a little bit of a breakthrough for me.
Yeah. I want to ask about the ending. In the story itself is pretty ambiguous what happens. I guess as a kid it was pretty ambiguous. As an adult going back and reading it again, it ends with Randy, the sort of nerdy boy, looking into the oil slick thing monster that's in the water. And throughout the story, the other characters who've been caught staring into the oil slick see the colors, are kind of hypnotized, mesmerized by it. And the story just ends. Like he's looking into it and you know he's going to get it. So
is he on the shore?
He's still on the raft. He never makes the leap, despite the fact that he kicks Laverne off the raft to sort of save himself from the encroaching slime thing that is reaching for him. What do you think about ambiguous endings and kids and readers? As an author for kids, can they handle that? Do they need answers?
I don't think they do, because kids are naturally curious and they love to keep things going. So in the Total Eclipse of Nestor Lopez, this is a story about a boy whose dad is overseas. He's deployed overseas. In the story, I don't bring Nestor's dad home. You don't know if Nestor's dad makes it home safely. But never once have I gotten a question from a kid if that happens or not. I do get questions of, are you going to write a sequel? But I always tell kids that they should make up the story themselves. Similarly, in The Ghosts of Rancho Espanto, this is a story about a boy whose mom has an illness. She has cancer, and it's not a mild one either. And at the end of the story, you don't know whether or not his mom is going to survive this. All you know is that he's going to be relying on the people around him to handle whatever comes next. And I've never gotten one question from a kid of, does Rafa's mom survive? They're not curious about that. They are asking me other questions about the story, because I honestly don't think that that matters to them. They have already imagined whatever they want to believe of how the story ends in their minds. They finished the story themselves, however they want it to end. And I think kids naturally do that. I did that as a kid. I would always imagine the endings of books, how I wanted them to end, because I think that they are still in that stage where they don't need fixed answers. I think as adults, we want A, B, and C all outlined for us. And kids don't need that so much. I think they're more comfortable with ambiguity. I think as authors, we need to be more comfortable with not wrapping up our stories in neat bows at the end. It's okay to not have these final chapters where everything is answered. You know, you don't have to do that.
In the stories from Tales and More Tales to Keep You Up at Night, there's a lot of stories that do very similar things to what Stephen King was doing in this story and a lot of his other stories, where he hints towards something horrible, possibly, and lets you fill in the blanks. And I think that that's actually a really wonderful teaching moment, especially for educators sharing these kinds of books in classrooms. If the kids are feeling frustrated or dissatisfied that, hey, I didn't get an answer, that's a great moment to say, well, write the answer you want. You know, tell the story in the way that you want to. I've actually had people write to me about the ending of one of my books where they got real mad about it. And they were like, so what we did together as a teacher and a student, or as a parent and a student, was we rewrote the ending the way we wanted it to be. And I was like, you know what? Good.
That's exactly what you should have done. Yeah, absolutely. No, I've gotten reader mail like that of, you know, I think you should have. I'm like, go ahead and write that. Absolutely. That's what fan fiction is, friends.
Yes, exactly. Getting back to the stories, these particular Creepshow stories and Tales from the Crypt stories, and a lot of the short stories that were in the EC comics from the 50s, the 40s and the 50s, the ones that were banned by the government, a lot of them feel like modern morality plays, right? The definition of the modern morality play is, or a morality play in general, historically, is the allegorical dramatizations of ethical principles. And we've already talked about how satisfied you felt that Randy at the end does not survive. I'm not sure if everybody on the raft deserved to die, but like, do you think that these kids got what they deserved? Even for just playing with the idea of trying to recapture a past season, the summer that is gone?
Well, I think now that you reminded me of what the final shot of the whole story is, where it pans over to that no swimming sign, it's almost like that's the lesson. Like, had they just listened and followed the rules, none of this would have happened. I was just so mad for how he treated the one girl on the raft. Sure. Because
unacceptable.
You know, I think even in the 80s, well, especially in the 80s, we were still seeing women in horror. Just, it was so bad.
Oh yeah. And
So
this one in particular as well.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so yeah, no, Randy deserved what he got. I was very happy when that happened to him. In that sense, though, it was like justice was served. All of a sudden, I was it was very funny how my allegiances shifted.
Mm.
Once the woman was injured and died, I was rooting for the substance.
Do you think that this is a horror subgenre, like the morality play aspect of some of these short stories that Stephen King wrote, or that a lot of the modern horror movies are sort of playing with? Is this a thing, this morality play? Do people need to get what they deserve in order to have the horror movie be a satisfying story?
I don't know because I think I hesitate to call it a morality play
Mm-hmm.
because it's almost like I don't know because I almost said it's almost like just karma, like you're getting the consequences of your actions. You know, the in the zombie film, the person who hides their bite is going to have bad things happen to them. I think that horror, what we're doing is examining the consequences of actions and the ill that is done on people or on a society. And so I think that I guess sometimes morals, because I feel like sometimes we're perhaps exploring a lack of morals. But yeah, I don't know. I hate to say that it's an exploration of like ethics and things
Mm-hmm.
like that because I watch horror to have fun.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly like I watch it for the gore and the surprise and things like that. But I do like how it pinpoints, you know, some societal ills, but I don't like preachy horror, I guess you
For
could
sure.
say. Like I wouldn't want that in my stories.
I feel like the satisfying stories, the satisfying horror movies, the satisfying scary books for all ages, I personally like some nuance, you know?
Yes,
I,
absolutely. I don't want it to just be gore for gore's sake sometimes. I mean, a good slasher film isn't bad.
the trope of the slashers where the teens who have sex immediately get killed, or even thinking about a little bit more recent and more complicated than that, like the movie The Babadook.
Yeah.
Like the idea of her being judged as a bad mother and what the consequences of that are. Like I think even that has more sort of nuance and complications, and those are the kinds of things that aren't necessarily cut and dry, black and white, you know? I think it's kind of
But it's
interesting.
fun to play with those tropes. Like you were saying, the teenagers who have sex and die, but then you get a movie like It Follows
Mm,
that takes that trope of the teenagers having sex, and that's the whole trope of the movie where you have to pass that curse on. Like I like movies like that where they take those horror tropes and kind of twist them and have fun with them. That's kind of neat.
there's a lot of stuff happening now in horror media that is not as black and white, cut and dry. And I think getting away from the old fashioned idea of the morality play that the Creepshow 2s, even the horror comics, all those things. I think it's healthy for us as a society, and I don't even know if that's even necessary to talk about like what's healthy for us as a society,
Yeah.
but in terms of art, what's interesting and what makes you want to pay attention, I think those nuances are more important than ethics. I want to talk to you about body horror and the body horror that exists in this film and also in your work, particularly No Brainer's Guide to Decomposition. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about what No Brainer's Guide is about?
Oh, sure. The
Yeah.
No Brainer's Guide to Decomposition is about a girl named Franny, and she lives at a forensic anthropology research facility, which is a body farm that her dad runs because he's the professor that works there. And one day, the cadavers that are buried at the body farm start to come back to life. And so Franny has to solve the mystery of why these cadavers are now wandering around before things get out of control. I had a lot of fun writing that book.
I bet. It sounds like you did a lot of research and
Yeah, I live just down the road from an actual body farm, and I got
wow.
to interview the professors that run it. I live near Texas State University, and they have the United States' largest body farm. University of Tennessee has the first body farm, but Texas State has the largest. And so I got to go research there, and it was really amazing and fun, and it was a definite bucket list item in my life.
For those who don't know, can you explain what a body farm is?
Yeah, so at a body farm, scientists sometimes bury, sometimes just lay on top of the ground cadavers that have been donated. People can sign like an advance directive will that says, you know, you'll donate your body to science after you die. And it's all to study the decomposition of what happens to our bodies after we die. Because you have to figure, they needed statistics for like law enforcement and things like that for when they happen upon a dead body. They need statistics to know like how long you've been dead. And so sometimes they place cages over the body so that animals won't disturb it. Sometimes they don't, so that animals can disturb it and they get information that way. I could go on about this because I love it so much. My husband and son were so ready for me to not be researching this book anymore because I would just start dropping stories over dinner of the things I was learning. And they were like, please stop talking about this. Because I love this information so much.
I wanted to ask you to describe the book so that easing into this question about body horror in general, we watched the kids on the raft slowly, each of them melt, some of them in more grotesque ways than others. I think for me, that was one of the reasons that this story has stuck with me for such a long time, because of that grotesque body melt imagery. Why do you think kids are fascinated by that kind of thing?
For me, I think so Laverne's death is the one that I remember. That is hands down the one that I remember, because I can still to this day remember her being laid down on the raft and it just the black bubbling up and it goes over her face and she starts screaming and it's amazing. I think for me in horror, when I watch a horror movie and the more over the top the gore is, the first thing that I think of is that it's somebody's job to get to do all those effects, to make splatter go across a wall, and how awesome and how mad I am at my guidance counselor in high school for not letting me know that that was an option, because that would have been so cool. But that's what I think, because here's the thing, and I think this is why I was so excited about researching no-brainers. We're all gonna die, and our bodies are all gonna decompose. This is a universal thing that's gonna happen to all of us, and we're all, fallible beings. And I think I'm just fascinated by how weak we all are. How fragile we all are. Yes. How are any of us walking around? I think sometimes I feel that way. And so, I think horror is amazing because it just, I think, highlights the fragility of us all. At the same time, I think also it highlights how some people are incredibly resilient, because sometimes you see people like, Jason still, how are you still up and walking around? You've been stabbed so many times.
Yes, electrocuted, stabbed,
exactly.
Buried alive,
no,
drowned.
My man, they had to put you through
chained
a
at the bottom of a lake. He's a hero to us all, looking for resilience.
Yep.
You say you were taken by Laverne's sort of death. I remember Deke. I don't know if you remember what happens to Deke, but this is the thing that sticks in my head, is he is basically about to try and swim for the shore. Deke is sort of like the muscly meathead guy. He's about to swim for the shore. Before he can jump off the raft, it comes up through the cracks in the raft and gets hold of his foot, and it pulls him right down very, very slowly. In the story that Stephen King wrote, it's even slower and more grotesque. But there's a point where, he's going through a very small crack in a hole in this raft, and his body has to fit through that hole in the crack, and his leg at a certain point just goes up and smacks him in the face, and he's pulled down with his foot next to his head. And I was like, this is so over the top. I was not thinking about it in terms of the makeup effects or the artist effects. I was literally just so horrified by the idea that somebody's body could bend in half that way. When kids experience this kind of extreme violence, like, obviously it has an effect on us. Like, we're remembering these images and stories from when we were kids, still talking about it. I guess in terms of how you created no-brainers and the gore and the actual very scientifically described decomposition of one of the characters, body parts falling off, the skin being so tender that, like, if you touch it, it tears, or like being just by accident touching a face and like the skin flipping and flopping all over the place. What was your process of deciding what to reveal, what to conceal, and considering what was too far? What was your limit? Like, I guess that's my question.
When I sent the manuscript to my editor, I made sure that she knew that everything I was describing, all of, I guess you could say, the gore, everything that happened to who we're describing is Mateo. He is one of the cadavers that Franny, the main character, discovers is a teenage boy who is not supposed to be at the body farm. She's got to figure out why he's there and why he's come back to life. Everything that happens to him, I made sure that my editor understood was scientific. None of it is gratuitous. None of it is just for fun. Because my goal with the book was that kids would understand forensic science. They would understand decomposition, all of that. None of it is what I consider excessive. And so I really had to be careful because, one, as a huge horror fan and a huge body horror fan, to me, there was no limit. Because in my research, and I read a lot of books about forensic scientists and things that they discovered and came across. I read so many things I wanted to put in this book, but it would have never been published for children. And I was really disappointed. My husband and son got to hear all about it. And so I just wanted to make sure that kids understood like the stages and what scientists do. So everything that happens to Mateo literally just mimics the stages of natural decomposition. At the same time, because Franny and Mateo become friends and you end up being rather sympathetic to Mateo, I kind of wanted to make it almost comical and over the top what happens to him. I mean, his arm falls off and they try to sew it back on and it's just hanging there, and they're using, Franny's sister's makeup to try to hide the fact that his cheek has ripped apart. Because I felt like coupling humor with horror is a perfect match to help kids with horror, because what is happening to Mateo is absolutely ridiculous. It is ridiculous, even though it is scientific. But I needed to make sure that my editor understood that, this isn't just horror for the sake of horror. It is scientific. My agent refused to read this book. She was so happy that only my editor was going to read it, because my agent is actually not a horror fan. She was very disappointed in the trajectory of my career. But yeah, I love forensic science, and I loved this opportunity to expose kids to it. But I was very conscious of the fact that I wanted to make sure that I wasn't exhausting kids. You can really make them numb with too much horror, because I know I'm very desensitized to particular horror, and so I didn't want to overdo it. So Mateo is pretty much the peak of what happens when we decompose.
It's interesting because you do go there And I love that you go there. I love children's literature that doesn't condescend to kids. I applaud you for that. I want to tell you a story about something that happened to me a couple years ago. If you don't mind, like a brief sort of, it doesn't have to do with the body farm or humans, but it has to do with a vacation and a rat trap out in the woods. Do you mind? Do you want to hear this?
Yes, let's go.
Because it makes me think of No Brainers Guide to Decomposition. So I had rented a cabin way out in the woods in Vermont a couple summers ago with a friend of mine. And I'm talking like miles and miles out in this state park. We had to drive down this very narrow, winding gravel road. This is just to set the scene about how isolated we were, and get to this cabin out by a very loud, rushing river that I actually really loved the sound of it. It sort of drowned out all other noise. As we're getting into this Airbnb and seeing what we can cook, seeing what appliances were there, what cookware was there, my friend discovered a rat trap underneath the sink in a cupboard. And there was a rat in there staring up at us, trapped, dead. And I mean, it looked alive, very fresh. And he was freaking out. He was like, I don't know if I can be in this house anymore. I don't know about this and that. I was like, I will take this trap and I will put it outside, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. And we can keep an eye out for any other little creatures or whatever, and, not worry about it. So take the trap, put it out by the front steps, sort of underneath the porch, and not realizing that every time I was going to come in and out of the house, there was going to be that little rat staring at me.
Your greeter.
So we go to bed, wake up in the morning, go on a hike, go explore the local towns. And when we come home, I'm approaching that front porch and seeing that trap, and the frickin' rat is moving. It is extending its arms out and like waving like this, and its head's moving back and forth. And I screamed and I said to my friend, it's still alive. Oh my God, it's been alive this whole time. What do we do? What do we do? And we're staring at it. I get closer. I'm like, I have to let it out of the trap. Like, what happened? And as I get close to it, this giant, and I'm talking giant green beetle, crawls out of its body and like crawls across its face. And I realize that it is filled with beetles. And
That's
the beetles
amazing.
are making this rat move as if it has been reanimated.
That is so awesome.
I died. I ran inside. I put my head under the pillow. And my friend, who was so freaked out about the rat being in the house, now was so fascinated that it was being very quickly devoured by the things that live out in the wild. He kept going out and peeking and seeing like how much it had been desiccated over the past 24 hours. It was so crazy. But I thought you might appreciate that story. And it was like the first time I ever really wondered if zombification was real or possible.
That's awesome. Man, see, I could have put that in No Brainers. I'm telling you, you can, if this is too gross, you can cut this out.
No, go ahead.
One piece of research that I tried so hard to think of a way that I could include this in the book, but I thought, no, this will get cut out so fast. It's too gross. In my research, one of the forensic scientists I read about, they had an assignment where they had to go investigate an explosion at a fireworks factory. And one of the people that died in the fireworks explosion had been bending over the bucket where they were illegally mixing these fireworks outside, and had been blown backwards through these trees. Well, they couldn't find the body. The only way they found the body was because as this gentleman had been blown back through the trees, a tree branch had hooked into his torso had hooked his intestines and reeled him out like fishing wire.
Oh.
And so they basically followed his intestines from a tree branch and down to the ground, and that was how they found his body. And I thought that was the most amazing thing ever. Like, I hope I go out that way, where you basically have to like scavenger hunt me for my intestines down to the ground. That is so cool. Yeah, after flying through the air.
Wow.
Anyways, I've already put in my request to Jesus for that. So
I mean, that is a way to go.
Yes, I know. How epic. But it's stuff like that I would read about. And as you know, my son and husband and I are eating our like mac and cheese over dinner, and it's squishing around on the plate. I'm like, oh, by the way, this is what I read about today.
This reminds me of this other thing.
Exactly.
I have a sort of like a coping mechanism, I guess you could call it, in my head whenever I hear of somebody dying horribly that way. I call it my list of oops, I died moments. It's a way for me to process like, yeah, any action we take, stepping off the curb or trying to fix an electrical socket by yourself or whatever. I put that into a list of oops, I died. I personally don't want to be blown up in a fireworks factory explosion, but I can see how that would definitely make a good story.
Exactly.
And speaking of good stories, to wrap this up, you have a new book coming out very soon. Can you tell the listeners what this is, the title, and what to expect? When's it coming out?
Yeah, sure. So What Fell from the Sky. Speaking of things falling from the sky, What Fell from the Sky comes out February 11, and it is a little bit of a shift from the No Brainer's Guide to Decomposition. This is a historical fiction fantasy, I guess you could say, because it is based on a true event that happened here in Texas in 1952. The United States military took over a town as practice for what would happen if, a communist force invaded, and they closed the schools, they closed the churches, they took over the newspaper, they imposed a curfew. And the people in town hated it. They were upset that the military destroyed their farms. They were messing everything up. And I was just fascinated that this was something that actually happened. And I decided I wanted to set a story here. But true to how I tell stories, I couldn't resist tossing aliens into the mix. So this story is about a boy named Pineda who this happens in his town. And in the middle of all these soldiers that have overrun his town, he's trying to reunite an alien he found in his barn with her family.
Well, it sounds creepy and heartwarming in the way that No Brainers was.
Exactly.
So it sounds great. I can't wait to pick up a copy and read it for myself. So yeah, that comes out February 11th, 2025, in case people are listening to this years in the future. I wish you the best of luck with that launch and spreading the word and getting people to read this book. It sounds really fun. I'm so happy that you came to talk with me about, your first fears, and especially this totally grody story by Stephen King and adapted by George Romero and Michael Gornick from 1987 when we were kids.
I know, blast from the past.
So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thanks again to Adrianna Cuevas. Her latest novel, What Fell from the Sky, is out soon, if not already by the time you're listening to this, and I hope you're able to check it out, with or without your kids. Speaking of kids, I've got a few books out there myself. Tales to Keep You Up at Night and More Tales to Keep You Up at Night are available in paperback now from Penguin Workshop, and you can also pre-order my upcoming picture book, My Brother's Butt is Haunted. In fact, I really hope you do. If you'd like to find me online, I'm still on Instagram at Dan Poblocks and at Our First Fears, and on Blue Sky at danpoblocki.bsky.social. You can also reach out at ourfirstfears@gmail.com. If you do want to get in touch, let me know. What ridiculous method of dying do you hope most to avoid, so that you can exit this world without saying, "Oops, I died"? Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.